Welcome, everyone. Today we are discussing how children learn to not be physically active, a bioecological perspective. And we have a great guest for the episode. Our guest has master's degree in sports science from University of Gothenburg and PhD in educational work from Karlstad University. And during his master's and PhD, he has worked in sport and leisure matters in local administrations. Currently, he is working as a senior lecturer of sports sciences in Karlstad University. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome our guest, Dr. Johan Högman. Welcome, Johan.
Thank you so much, Olli. It's great to be here on the podcast.
Yeah, nice to have you. So, if we start about physical activity as both physiological and social and cultural phenomenon.
Yeah, well, that was kind of a start for me when I was approaching this topic in my research. I start wondering and thinking about the phenomenon of physical activity and especially then for children, of course. And of course, I think physical activity is a physiological phenomenon. It's about moving bodies and children moving their bodies, and bodies are physical and biological. But I think in order to understand a little bit more about the conditions and how and why children move and why some children does not move, it's really important to dig deeper into the social dimensions and also the cultural dimensions of the phenomenon.
And how do you see the fact that usually this physical activity has become equated with sports, this kind of sportification? You have discussed that also.
Yeah, and I think it's partly related to the issue of how physical activity is viewed, and in my thinking or in my view of physical activity is just it's something that you do with your body. It doesn't really matter what kind of activity. It's still physical activity, even if it's housework or if it's gardening or whatever children may be playing. It's still physical activity. But in, let's say, the last decades or for several decades, we have started to view physical activity more and more as something that has to be organized. It has to be have a certain structure. Perhaps has to have a coach and a predetermined time for the beginning and the end and stuff like that. And I think that's a part of a larger trend where ch- children's lives are being more organized, more structured, and we, both parents and other adults, are not fine with just letting kids move as they want or just play without our supervision. We want organized and formal settings for our children. And when it comes to physical activity, then if children maybe for say 60 years ago they just were physically active for many hours each day, just playing around and of course taking breaks and so, but they played around for a greater for more time each day. Today we are more focused on engaging our children in the particular sports clubs or settings, organized settings where children are supposed to learn very specific types of physical activity, and we're not appreciating the more free and informal physical activity in the same way for our children.
Yeah. Actually, if you can take the microphone a little bit closer, I hear it a little bit low volume, so it might be a bit better. Yeah, perfect. Yeah, and I think even I've been in UK, and I think there it's even more that there's this top sport, and then you are either very good in sport or you can maybe play a little bit something in the park, but there's not much in between. And I think same in US. I think in the Nordic countries it's a little bit better that, but we still have the sport. What do you see that how we can get rid of the sportification or too much sportification?
Well, that's a really good question, and I think it's something of an change in attitude, I think, is needed from really several actors in relation to the child. Because I mean, parents today have some responsibility in and are driving this process, as parents today are very like stressed that their kids won't keep up with development of other kids. They want their kids to be good in school. They want their kids to be good at sports. They want their kids to be good at everything. And then parents are very eager to place their children in sports club, even though perhaps the child is not that interested in sports particularly, but rather would like to play more freely and perhaps play informal sports. So I think parents have a responsibility, but also like more of the actors. I mean, as researchers, we have to produce knowledge about various kinds of activities that contributes with very valuable physical activity for children that is not sports as well, because I think parents needs to know that there are other options as well, that sports isn't just the only activity that can contribute with the physical activity on a daily basis. There are a lot of other activities as well. And I mean, of course, the school has a great responsibility as well. There is a problem with how physical education is taught in school in Sweden, and I know in many other countries have the problem of physical education being like the same thing as organized sports. It's just like organized sports, but in the school context. And I mean, that's a huge one of the reasons that of the sportification process, that instead of learning children in school what physical activity might be, or how they might be physically active in their own way, we taught them, or we teach them to engage in particular sports. We teach them rules in the sports that if we're in Sweden, we teach them how to play football, or teach them how to go ice skating or play basketball and the big sports. But of course, in other countries, they have other sports that are taking place in physical education, and that's also I think a reason to why the sportification process has gone so long, because schools has to take a step away from this view of how physical activity, or at least integrate more perspectives on what physical activity might be.
Yeah, and as I'm now thinking it, it's very separate that you have sport classes in a certain time of the day and it's in a certain place, and then other times you're just sitting there the whole day in the class, and those are just two distinct. So there's no kind of interplay when you could be active throughout the day. So maybe the PE teachers should be in the recess and breaks there also
Yeah.
instructing and teaching how you can be physically active. And you have been using the bioecological theory in your studies. Could you tell a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I think bioecological theory is a very good theory in many ways, but it's also a kind of a tricky theoretical framework to use as well, because it says a lot of aspects. It's a great theory to understand like all the conditions that or to make visible a lot of conditions that influence children's physical activity. It's basically a theory about how the individual child in this case interacts with a very complex system of factors, one can say, environmental factors. And these environmental factors can be placed in various environmental system. Like I think many know about like the microsystem, the mesosystem, the exosystem, and the macrosystem. And that's an important part of the bioecological theory to understand how the environment is constituted by several systems. But I think the most important thing, or perhaps the strength of the theory, is to try to understand how the child, that is also can be viewed as a system consisting of various factors, then like psychological factors or individual traits or abilities or whatever it might be, how these factors interact with different environmental factors. So and these factors can be then in the microsystem. For instance, if a child have a very good confidence, for instance, it will interact better with the environment, the closest environment, because they have the confidence to explore or to explore the environment. So that's interaction, but it will also interact on a more macro level, for instance, through culture or the interaction between the individual child's identity in relation to the particular culture in which the child finds herself then. So this theory is, I would say, simultaneously quite complex, but also quite easy to use and trying to start mapping out different factors that are important to consider when trying to understand children's physical activity in depending on which context you use it in.
Mm. And if we go a little bit more practical, if you use it in a study, do you, for example, take that you are looking the microsystem and the child's psychology, or do you try to map all of those in a one study, or how do you do it in practice?
Well, I think the best thing to do, I haven't conducted the idle study for using this theory, but if if you are planning a study now and trying and using this theory, uh, I I would try to have some kind of comparative study using two groups. Perhaps I would say it would be very interesting to compare groups on like a macro level and try to investigate how different cultural or social and social cultural factors differ in relation to physical activity between groups. Let's say, for instance, in Sweden and in another part of the world, it's two groups placed in two different.
Mm.
So you can compare these groups, how they relate to physical activity, for instance. And within these groups, you have to get the interaction effect. You can have one, to make it easy, perhaps one individual characteristic or factor that you compare. So you can say gender, for instance. If you take in both these groups, it's boys and girls, and perhaps
Mm.
they will differ on these social cultural matters in relation to physical activity, depending on if they're boys or girls in different parts of the world. Uh, so that's like a base, and according to bioecological theory, because it's a developmental theory, you should also make longitudinal studies. So you have to have at least two time points for measuring or collecting data, but I think it's recommended to use three
Mm.
time points to collect data. That's like the basic of using it, but it's, I think there's a lot of ways of using this theory, and I have seen a lot of studying using it in whole other ways. You can use various kinds or types of bioecological theoretical frameworks, for instance, for doing systematic reviews, or you can just, like as I was saying earlier, you can more map out different factors in the context in which you're doing the research. If as I have done in one study, perhaps in an interview study, trying to map out the important factors from the child's perspective. So interviewing the children on factors in their systems that will influence them, and then try to like investigate if this differs depending on the some of the child's individual characteristics. So I have focused in one study on gender, and I also focused on ability. So if the children experience some environmental factors differently depending on their level of physical ability, for instance.
Mm. Yeah, sounds very very interesting.